Hi, people. I've just read an article in the Times about the latest situation in Shanghai. Now, Shanghai is under an unprecedented lockdown, unprecedented in the sense that throughout this entire pandemic, I don't think there has been such a restrictive measure on such a large city. Shanghai has a good claim to being the biggest city in the world. From my research, this is something I've studied closely. It vies with Tokyo and a couple of others for that claim. And it is actually the largest city proper in the world that is within city boundaries as opposed to metropolitan area. Regardless, it's a huge city. 25 million people in the municipality. Um, and this isn't just a lockdown in the sense that we've seen in the UK, which is bad enough. I mean, we've seen in the UK the sort of impact it's had on mental health and social tensions and so on. In England right now, and to a lesser extent in Scotland, I was visiting my family for Easter. Um, One would almost think the pandemic's gone. No one's wearing masks anymore. Few places are imposing that. It's not gone. We shouldn't think it is, but one almost gets the impression that it's pretty much we're at the phase now where it is people are just moving on. I think that's a good thing because the majority are vaccinated. I think there is no practical or moral reason to continue serious restrictions. Even on national railways, they weren't checking masks. There's no evidence that the hard lockdowns actually made a difference in terms of the number of infection rates. But so to see what's happening in Shanghai now, 2 years on from when this all broke out, most likely in Wuhan, um, it's shocking. Um, Earlier this year, there was also a lockdown in Xi'an, which is also a sizable city. But what's happening in Shanghai is dystopian. And I'm not going to read out the whole Times article. It's a little bit long, but there's some bits I want to draw attention to. A woman in Shanghai with late-stage ovarian cancer said on social media that she was close to running out of her life-saving pills, and an HIV patient said he had only 5 days of medicine left. A man who gave his family name as Zhong told the Times that 2 weeks after the lockdown, all he had left was two cucumbers, two potatoes, one onion, two pieces of ginger, two courgettes, a bag of biscuits, a can of luncheon meat, and some tangerines. That's to last him for an unknown period. Do you think that's enough? Zhang 40 said. We're running out of food, starving to death, and the government doesn't care. Starving to death. Now, in the UK, when people had to self isolate, there was a given time period, 10 days, and it was inconvenient, but the government gave people money for food and so on. I remember early in the pandemic, I was somewhat concerned about that. I thought, well, how are people going to get food, basically, basic essentials? And certainly the pressure on, say, a young family living in a tower block would be very different from people with more space. In China, in Shanghai, I should say specifically, because this is a localized rate of infections, as I understand it. There's no time frame, and what is absolutely perverse is the Chinese government, the world's second biggest economy, is putting these people in this nightmarish situation where it's forcing them into these pretty much prison-like conditions, locked in their own homes. Those who aren't locked in their own homes are being forced out of their apartments so they can be turned into quarantine centres. And there's no time frame. There's no time frame, and they're not being given any access to food. Now, I've lived in China, albeit in much smaller cities in Shanghai. I've been to Shanghai. I know it fairly well. I've been there 4 times, um, visiting friends and visiting the city. But the way it works in China is you get these sort of communities. You usually get power blocks and these communities run by big housing companies like Evergrande, and they tend to have their own facilities. So you'll have a supermarket, and sometimes the better buildings will even have shops in the basement, their own shops. So they might have that, but they're going to have limited supplies. Supplies aren't going to be coming in if this is all cut off. And the images are truly disturbing. One of them showed hundreds and hundreds of people literally wailing into the night. And if this sounds like hyperbole, people starving, consider the fact that the world's worst famine, the very worst famine in human history, the Great Chinese Famine or Mao's Great Famine, also known uh, in Chinese vernacular as Three Bitter Years, from 1958 to 1961, roughly speaking, that cost at least 36 million deaths. At least. It may have been higher. Worst famine in human history. Now, that is within living memory, and that is what the communist regime done to its own people, because Mao would not open the grain warehouses in Henan province. Um, so the notion of people starving to death in one of the world's great cities, one of the world's biggest cities, it's dystopian, but I wouldn't put anything past the CTP. I think they've taken the view that COVID has embarrassed us enough. And much of the world is blaming China for COVID, rightly so, because if they had um, taken this seriously from the very start, instead of punishing those doctors who were trying to warn about it, for spreading gossip, um, then it could have been a localized epidemic as opposed to a worldwide pandemic. The whole world has suffered. And don't be under any illusions that this thing is still causing suffering around the world. Ukraine has understandably been the major news this year, but thousands of people are still dying from COVID. At least 6 million people have died worldwide. The true figure is going to be a lot higher. It's the deadliest pandemic in a century. AIDS has killed more people, but that's over a longer period of time. So I don't know. For me, I'm wondering, is this a turning point? I mean, in the quarantine centers, there was I saw this young woman and she was basically just crying. She'd broken down. She obviously was having a mental collapse. Um, there's foreigners there as well. The uncertainty that these people are facing is awful. If the government has to do this, at least give people the means to have food. I mean, in the 60s, China was a poor country. Today, it's a middle income country by GDP per capita, but it is the world's second biggest economy. In other words, there's no excuse for the CCP not to feed its own people. None. And it just shows the cruelty and the callousness. And I wonder, could this be a turning point? Shanghai played a very important role in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Um, I'm not suggesting this is a Tiananmen moment, but we have here a situation where millions of people in one of China's most important cities, its largest city, are furious with the Communist Party and what they're doing. Um, I remember an acquaintance of mine, and she was very forcefully pro CCP. We had rather an awkward debate when I was out there. I wonder if she's still there. I wonder what she thinks now. I'm not really in touch with her anymore, but I hope she's okay. But I do wonder, will this be a turning point? Will the Chinese people finally see how how much contempt the government has for them? It's all about control. So I honestly think the CCP's attitude is we just need to control this. Let's just lock down the whole city. And if people complain, they're troublemakers. It's kind of a stupid approach. Um, I could understand them having restrictions, but not allowing people the means to access food is utterly inhumane. And all it's going to do is breed anger. So the CCP is shooting itself in the foot with this. But I really feel for people who are in this situation. Um, I'm just looking at the report. It hasn't mentioned the same thing in Beijing. I am still doing tutorial work, and I have a student in Beijing. She hasn't mentioned anything about restrictions. I might actually ask her about this. I'm always a bit wary about getting into too many political areas with my students because it's not a path I want to go down. But if she brings it up, I'll certainly ask these questions. I mean, I mean, like I said, being to Shanghai, I'm just trying to imagine what this is like. This isn't some small provincial city. This is Shanghai. So, um, official figures show 172 people have died. It's possible that the mortality rate is low in Shanghai because the measures have been so extreme, but what effect lockdowns have are a matter of debate. They've had mixed results in this country. Certainly, the official Chinese death toll of about 4,800 is a massive, massive underestimate, under-report figure. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that because when the pandemic broke out, people were reporting that there were funerary urns in the city of Wuhan that were much, much higher than the normal rate. Now, China's a country of 1.4 billion people. If if the UK can have 160,000 deaths, we have 67 million people. Even if you consider it's not going to be an exact proportion to a country's population, the idea that China has just 4,800 deaths from COVID, it just seems absurd. It's going to be a lot higher, a lot higher. Um, but this once again shows that the only thing the CCP cares about is control. They don't give a damn about human rights. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But could this be a turning point? I don't know. I do think that people in Shanghai won't easily forget this. They won't forget how they were treated. They won't forget that when they were trying to get the most basic means, food, they were prevented from doing so. Um, I mean, this should not be happening in 2022 in the world's second biggest economy. It's not like these are wartime conditions and China's a poor country. China's a powerful country, a rising superpower, second biggest economy. It should not be happening. And it's a disgrace. If you happen to have access to a VPN and you're in Shanghai, tell me what's the situation? How are you getting food? What are you doing? I really, really do sympathize with people there.